38 years as the head coach at Tennessee, 8 national championships, an all-time record of 1,098 victories, and a 100% graduation rate, which was the real point of all the winning. 27 successful years of marriage, followed by 1 shattering breakup, 6 crushing miscarriages, compensated for by 1 matchless, peerless son, for which I am grateful to God. 2 devastating and incurable medical diagnoses. None of that sums it up. A memoir is not a documentary. We think we keep an accurate record of ourselves in the bean-counting tablets of our mind, but we don't. None of us sees or remembers everything about one's life. Memories are unreliable. They smudge and fade, like disappearing footprints in the sand. We're too busy standing in the middle of all of it to remember everything perfectly. And I was busier than most. And this is a paragraph from the book we're going to talk about today, Sum It Up by Pat Summitt and Sally Jenkins.
Welcome to Performers, the podcast that takes you into the minds of the world's most extraordinary athletes, coaches, and performers. We're your hosts. I'm Dr. Greg Young, and you've just heard from Dr. Duncan Simpson, and as sports psychology experts, we'll guide you through the pages of their autobiographies, revealing the mindsets, strategies, and habits that propelled the world's best to the pinnacle of their fields. So Duncan, why this book today?
Well, we both have a personal connection to Pat Summitt as Tennessee graduates. We were both there during the last 2 titles that they won in 07 and 08. And here is an abbreviated list of her accomplishments. So, as I said, 1,098 wins. When she retired, she was number 1 all-time in basketball coach history. She's now 4th all-time. She won 8 national championships, 16 SEC championships, 16 SEC tournament championships, 8-time SEC Coach of the Year, 7-time National Coach of the Year. Every Lady Vol who completed her eligibility at Tennessee also graduated with a degree, which is an amazing accomplishment. She had 36 consecutive seasons with 20-plus victories. She never had a losing season. She won a gold medal winner as a coach with the 1984 U.S. Women's Olympic team. She won a silver medal as a player and was co-captain in 1976 with the U.S. Women's National Team. She graduated from the University of Tennessee Martin, leaving the school as the all-time leading scorer there. And she's been inducted into 5 Halls of Fame. Just a few more because these are big times. So in 2000, she was named the Naismith Basketball Coach of the Century. In 2008, the ESPY Award for the Best Coach of the Year. She was named in Sporting News list of the 50 greatest coaches of all time. In 2011, she was named Sports Illustrated Sports Person of the Year, shared with Mike Krzyzewski at the time. And in 2012, she received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Barack Obama. So, I'm exhausted just even going through her list of accomplishments. I think we can safely say that Pat Summitt has some coaching chops. And if you can't learn something from Coach Summitt, and I'm not just talking about coaching, I think we're talking about leadership and about how to mentor young people. And I think you're listening to the wrong podcast. And as I mentioned, we have a special connection because we both went to Tennessee while Pat Summitt was still coaching there. But I know you also had the opportunity to meet Coach Summitt personally. So how about you share a little impression of the times that you got an opportunity to spend any time with her?
Yeah, I think the list that you've just rattled off there, the word legend gets thrown around a lot, and it's very, very popular. But I think if we're going to talk about anyone that actually fits the mold of what a legend is, we couldn't have picked a better person today. But you're absolutely right. You know, obviously both of us were at the University of Tennessee, and getting the opportunity to meet Coach Summitt, and I was fortunate to meet her via the women's soccer coach at the time, Ange Kelly. Had the opportunity to spend some time with her, had the opportunity to play golf with her a couple of times, which is excellent. A very, very competitive person, as you might imagine. Now, to be honest, before I'd actually met her in person, much like everyone else, my only impressions had come from watching her on the TV. And if you don't know anything about Pat Summitt's life, from watching the TV, you will know that she's a pretty intense person, and she has this sort of character or this persona that she really embodies when she's coaching during a basketball game. And tough, really tough looking tough looking person, but honestly could not be further from that when she's away from the court. Very, very kind person, very, very welcoming person, very generous person. Not only just sort of, welcoming you in, having conversations, just with that time and our willingness to share information. So I'm very, very fortunate to have spent some time with her. And, even if you only spend a few moments with people like this, you learn a ton. You might not realize it at the time, but when you get the chance to reflect on it, you do learn so much information. And she definitely left her impact on me, and as she did with so many other people.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that little backstory to a brief time that you spent with her. I think we do have a little bit of big news, big news that we can catch the listeners up on. So even though you've got a face for radio, Performance Pod is now on YouTube. By high demand, of course. Everyone's been begging us to be on YouTube. Everyone. So search Performance Pod and the book title, and we should come up. We're throwing some shorts up there. We're learning the YouTube algorithm, so try and find us on there. And Greg, over to you. We've got one other thing to ask from the listeners, and then we'll get on with the show.
Yeah, I'm back to ask you for a virtual handshake here. So like I said last time, we're going to continue to put the work in on this end to try and make this continue to happen. And the only thing that we need for you to do is to pause this show right now, to pop over to whatever platform you choose to listen to, or in fact, you can now watch us, which is, like you say, a terrifying thing, and hopefully give us a 5-star rating. Don't forget, you can follow the show, subscribe to the show, make sure that you don't miss any episodes. And of course, we'd absolutely love it if you'd leave a comment or a review. Share your favorite episode with a friend, get a book club together, whatever it is, spread the good word here. Without your help, we can't continue to do what we're doing and what we're really enjoying doing. So we really, really hope we continue to get your backing. And of course, if you want to dive any deeper into any of the books that we discuss, please support the authors and click the links in our show notes to get a hold of the books. And this will again help to support us and the show that we've got here. So let's get back to the important stuff.
I remember every player, every single one who wore the Tennessee orange, a shade that our rivals hate, a bold, aggravating color that you usually find on a roadside crew or in a correctional institution, as my friend Wendy Larry jokes. But to us, the color is a flag of pride because it identifies us as Lady Vols and therefore as women of unmistakable type, fighters. I remember how many of them fought for a better life for themselves. I just met them halfway. I remember the faces on the young women who ran suicide drills, flame-lunged and set-jawed, while I drove them with a stare that burned up the ground between them and me. I remember chewing on the inside of my lip over losses until I had a permanent entrenched scar. I remember being so possessed by the job that I coached in my sleep. I'd toss and kick until I woke myself up hollering, "Get down the floor." That's a good Tennessee impression right there. I remember standing on the sideline and stamping my high heels on the hardwood so furiously it sounded like gunshots, and whacking my hands on the scorer's table until I flattened the gold championship rings on my fingers. I remember jabbing a finger into the official's face and backing him from mid-court to the baseline. I remember the second-by-second adjustments, the dialing up of players' emotions in the huddles, operating on pure feel, calling plays less by rational process than by some kind of buried sense of rhythm. I remember the speed of decision-making, who needs the ball, who needs to be in the game, and how I love that. I remember all of this, but there are also things I don't remember, things that I know are important and that I should remember. In the late spring of 2011, I was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease. The doctor told me that given my diagnosis, he felt that I should no longer work at all. I should step down immediately because in his opinion, dementia would progress rapidly. I needed to quit and get myself out of the public eye as quickly as possible, or I would embarrass myself and ruin my legacy. As he spoke, I felt my fist clench. It was all I could do to not lunge across the desk and drop him with one punch. Who did he think he was? Even if I had an irreversible brain disease, what right did he have to tell me how to cope with it? Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? I said, my voice rising. You don't know me, and you don't know what I'm capable of. So the last bit, Greg, for me is a little bit sad because obviously we know that Pat eventually passed away from Alzheimer's, but it simultaneously makes me laugh because she's sat across the desk from the doctor who's given her this diagnosis. And she's not having any of it.
Not in the slightest. I don't know about you, but when I hear you read through that, I can picture the doctor in a black and white striped jersey with a whistle around his neck, and she's going at him like one of the referees that she would be going at him in a game.
Just a little extra about Alzheimer's. She says Alzheimer's might affect other people, but it never met Pat Summitt. I was someone to reckon with, a person of uncompromising substance based on 38 years of unbroken triumph, and personified in 161 players who had won fistfuls of banners and trophies. I'd been named the head coach of the women's basketball at the University of Tennessee when I was just 21 years old. I'd hand-built every aspect of the program and handpicked every player associated with it. It wasn't just a job, it was my life, my home. And for me, it's just complete and utter investment, and I'd say obsession from Pat Summitt.
Yeah, when you talk about drive and you talk about direction and purpose, I think being the architect, being the builder, being the custodian, and just someone that gets the opportunity to pass a program on to someone else, when you've got so much invested in it, obsession is the only way to go.
Quit? Coaching? Coaching isn't social work. It's more than just a game. It's a heartfelt vocation, a calling in which you are powerfully bonded to the students who need you. It's a job that engages all your mind and muscle and spirit, a job in which you grab kids by the arm and you pull them out of their respective emotional fires, whatever that fire is, and you show them what real self-worth looks like. Sometimes I almost wanted to say to a kid, I'm going to save you from yourself, and you don't even realize you need it. So for me, this strikes just how deep her purpose was. It's a calling for her.
Yeah, there's not many professions that you kind of associate that calling thing to. The only one I can think of is sort of, going into religion, going into the clergy, right? You're answering a call. I don't know if anyone is an accountant or a bricklayer and they'd consider that to be a calling that they've got. But you're right. It really drives that purpose. If you have such a deep and meaningful and personal connection with the thing that you're doing for a job, I mean, how can you not consider that to be a calling?
And she continues, quit. We keep score in life because it matters. It counts. Too many people opt out and never discover their own abilities because they fear failure. They don't understand commitment. When you learn to keep fighting in the face of potential failure, it gives you a larger skill set to do what you want to do in life. So this theme of commitment and fighting through adversity, this comes up over and over in the book.
Without a shadow of a doubt, it's a theme that we're going to see not only from Pat, but also from the people that interact with Pat, whether that's coaches, whether that's player. Commitment's going to be something that is a central and driving factor here throughout all of the stories.
So there's a nice self-reflection and putting a kind of bow on her own Alzheimer's disease. And she makes a connection to what she tells her athletes. And she says, all of my life, I preached taking ownership to athletes. I insisted they commit to their talent and to themselves, not just by working at the things they were good at, but by admitting the things they weren't good at. It was difficult, counterintuitive thing to teach. No one feels strong when they examine their own weaknesses. But in facing weaknesses, you learn how much there is in you. You find a blueprint for real strength. You don't look away from the difficult things. I urge our athletes, take ownership. When you own something, you possess it, live it, act on it. It was a time to take ownership of my diagnosis. The question was how? What was the best way to confront it? Was it better to retire and concentrate on fighting Alzheimer's? Or was it way too much of a concession to the disease? In order to decide, I had to review everything I thought about. And that's kind of really what prompted her to write this book.
Yeah, there's a line that I really like, obviously classic from Socrates here, who said, the unexamined life is not worth living. And I think that's something that we really preach to our athletes and coaches and people that we work with in the field of sport performance and performance in other domains is, we've mentioned self-awareness, and it's impossible to have self-awareness without having some sort of examination.
And as Pat reflects, we go back, as in many of the books, we go back to her childhood. And it says, it had something to do. I understood vaguely with how I was raised, the fourth of 5 children and the first girl in a southern farm family. Outside, in the fields, I was treated the same as my older brothers, namely, like a farmhand. I did the same work as a man, but in every other instance, women came second, and I had to fight for respect. I was going to prove I could come in first. I couldn't stand to be second at anything. A bet, a dare, a race, or nightly games of basketball with my brothers in the hayloft. If I lost, I'd tell them, we're going to play again after we finish supper. If I lost again after supper, I'd say, we're going to stay out here all night. We'd play until I was on the winning side because I had no intention of going to bed in second place. So early on, we hear that competitive drive. She's got her older brothers. She's working hard on the farm as a young woman, but she's not treated as a first-class citizen because this is back in the 1960s. Girls were treated very differently.
You know, you hear this idea of competitiveness, and we've always got this idea of, well, are things like competition and competitiveness, are they innate traits, characteristics that people are essentially born with? Is it something that you can learn and something that you can develop? And I think the answer to those questions is yes. It's probably a little bit of both, right? It's something that you're born with and something that is nurtured. That's the other side of the nurture argument, right? Something that you've got to continue to entice and evolve as you continue to grow. And again, as we've seen with other athletes, that's something that happens based on the environment that you're in. And when you find yourself as essentially a farmhand working with your brothers in this really competitive environment, competitive people find a way to make everything competitive.
We played practically every night, and my father never stopped us. As long as we'd done our work, it was our one indulgence. Basketball in the loft was physical. We were big kids, and there was a lot of blocking and setting screens that turned into shouldering and shoving. If you drove in for a layup and someone pushed you, you went through the gallery door and into the long drop into the hay below. They talked smack, and so did I. When they really wanted to get under my skin, they would call me sissy. Come on, sissy, let's see what you got. So this concept of play, we saw this with Dan Carter, this idea of just going out and playing, and she's playing in the hayloft every night with her brother.
Yeah, I can't imagine there was a lot of fouls called. You know, I don't imagine anyone spent a lot of time at the line shooting free throws. It sounds like you had to develop the necessary skills to survive a game of basketball in this hayloft. I don't think that's too strong of a word. I also like the idea that we talked about this with Dan Carter when he was out in the streets with friends and playing sort of different versions of rugby, not just specifically rugby as it is in the structured game, where you've got the kind of the social element to this as well, where you're figuring out what's a foul and navigating rules, and you're allowed to do this and you're not allowed to do that. And it sounds very much like this is where that physical style of basketball is born. This is the origin story, as it were, of probably Lady Vol basketball X amount of years from the time. But you know, it's kind of like a Marvel comic, right? Every superhero has their origin story, and this sounds very much like that's where this is born from.
Yeah, and here's a quote from one of her brothers, Kenneth. It says, "We played rough at times, and she would hit just like a guy. It didn't matter. You better hit her because she was going to hit you. We played football in the front yard too. Tackle." So she played tackle football too. And, you know, just as a kind of a side thought, what are your thoughts on female athletes growing up with older brothers?
That's a great question. I think, and this is me sitting entirely on the fence, I realize that as I'm formulating this answer in my head. It depends, right? It's when we talk about the environment and we talk about, you know, a girl playing with her three male brothers here, it kind of depends on how the brothers are interacting with her as well, right? She might be really willing and wanting to get in kind of the sort of the rough and tumble, but the fact that brothers are including her here, right? Even though she is a quote unquote second class citizen in this environment, in other means, when it comes to sport, it looks very much like it's almost like a meritocracy here, where it's like, hey, listen, if you want to come and play with us, this is the way that we play. If you can hang, you can hang. You're part of us. You're part of the group. You're part of the social thing that we've got going on here. So I think some people would thrive in that environment, and I think some people would really, really struggle in that environment. And that's why my answer is, it depends.
As it always does.
It always does.
My father was very firm. He had a giving heart, and he worked himself to the breaking point in the fields every day to provide for his family. Nothing got you punished quicker than not meeting your responsibilities on the farm. The family came first. Putting food on the table was more important than any hobby or game you had. Daddy taught us that we were all counted on to share the load. Before you did anything else, you had to contribute to the family upkeep. We lived from crop to crop, and we didn't think of it as hard work so much as a necessity. So early on, she's learning to be part of a team.
I think this is a really early glimpse into kind of her why, that really driving, motivating fact. They talk about the importance of family. Family comes first, putting food on the table. Survival is a very strong word, but that's kind of what it is. Making sure you've got the means to be able to survive and live. When I think about Pat Summitt and I think about Lady Vol basketball, I don't immediately gravitate towards a single player. There's not someone that jumps out of my mind. The team itself, the concept of team and the concept of collectiveness is the thing that jumps out when I hear sort of the name Lady Vol basketball. And that's really, really important. And I think team and the development of people as a collective is something that we're going to absolutely, from one of the greatest team sport coaches of all time, if not the greatest, we're going to see that throughout this.
So one of the key lessons she learned was hard work. And she says, I learned hard work never killed anyone. There were a few days when I thought it would. We would be up at 3:30 in the morning to chop tobacco before it got too hot. Then we'd go back to the garden to pick okra, which you had to wear long sleeves to do, otherwise the prickles would irritate your skin. Then when it got cooler in the late afternoon, we'd go back to the tobacco fields and chop some more. It was partly out of necessity that we worked, but it was also a matter of philosophy for my parents. So hard work was just part of that family ethos right from the beginning. And she mentioned very humble beginnings, but hard work was imprinted on her. And I think, that was another symbol of the Tennessee teams that Coach Summitt had was hard work was absolutely imperative if you were going to play for her.
Work here is really important, obviously, and I think play is on the other side of things, right? All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. So basketball here sounds like kind of that. How do you spend your free time? Even though hard work is still part of basketball here, it's not the hard work, kind of the sweat and toil in the field, as it were. It's sort of the reward after that. So maybe something that you're looking forward to get you through the day.
And I think these humble beginnings also set her up to work with some of the young women that came into the program, because she said later, when some of the young women who played for me were self-conscious about their lack of wherewithal, I told them to make something out of themselves. Don't think I'm ignorant as to how you grew up, I said. So Pat was very aware of her humble beginnings, and it's mentioned a lot. And she was also very aware of that with her athletes, that some would come in and have never been in a hotel room, that have never been on an aeroplane. And she made sure that they understood that I know I've been there and I've come through that.
Yeah, shared struggle there is something where you can find real alignment and values. And if empathy or connection can be born from that in a coach-athlete relationship, that puts you on a really powerful footing to continue to develop that relationship and really have each other's backs.
So back in the 60s, early basketball in Tennessee. So very different game. This was something I wasn't aware of, but back in those days, girls basketball in the state of Tennessee was a strange, inhibited half-court game with 6 players on a side. 3 players stayed on one side of the court, and there were 3 players on the other, and crossing midcourt was forbidden for the fear that we might faint. Gym teachers in those days didn't believe girls were capable of running full court. We were capable of heavy farm work and absorbing whippings, but for some reason, they didn't think that we could run 94 feet without passing out or damaging our ovaries. So just a little bit of kind of comedy there, but also interesting kind of flashback to where she grew up. That it was a half court game and girls weren't allowed to do it.
I think there was this could be complete lies, and I don't mean to intentionally lie here. I feel like I remember when I was taking like history of physical education that someone had accidentally copied the rules of basketball down incorrectly, which is how we ended up with sort of that model of women's basketball, and also how we ended up with netball in the UK and elsewhere, right, where there's sort of set positions you're allowed to go certain places and all that kind of stuff. Basketball's never. It took a while for basketball to develop. Once upon a time, they played it with peach baskets, but they didn't cut the bottom out of them. So they had to have a ladder next to the court to get the ball out every time someone scored. Genius. It wasn't until someone cut a hole in the basket that we got what we kind of realized we've got today. But the other thing is, historically, this is something that's been sort of placed on women essentially by men, right? This idea that they don't have the physical capabilities, the physical capacity to do something, particularly in the way that men can do it.
And for Pat Summitt, I think that idea of the women were treated less was something that she probably went to the nth degree to push her female players to show them what they were capable of, because she grew up in this era where she was treated differently. And I think that probably came that manifested itself with that intensity and the way she pushed her players almost to breaking point, which we'll talk about. But she was so determined that they won't have these constraints on them psychologically. So there's some parallels here with a couple of other athletes. She said, I sat at dinner one night bemoaning the fact that Clarksville High School didn't have basketball for girls. When my dad suddenly spoke, which he didn't do very often, he said, well, we'll just move then. There was an old white farmhouse, unoccupied and in disrepair. My father bought it, and we moved into Henrietta, simply so I could go to Ashland City High School, which had a very good girls' team. My parents left their warm, solid, convenient new house for a rickety old place. It was hardship, but they did it for me.
There's definitely parallels with Andre and with Lindsay, but when you think about what Lindsay and Andre were moving for, Lindsay said, I want to be an Olympic champion. Andre was wanting to be world number one. This is to go and play high school. But I played high school basketball. I mean, that's not really the pinnacle of anything, but to make such a big commitment and a big jump and literally pick up sticks and relocate just to give the opportunity to play this game. I've got no no understanding about how you make that big jump.
Who, back in the 1960s, sized up their daughter's jump shot and decided it was important enough to sacrifice for? Almost nobody. In 1968, just 16,000 American women played college sports, and most of them did it under a shadow of someone else's disapproval, whether parents who thought it was maybe unladylike or boyfriends who thought it was a waste of time. But my father valued my talent and had an instinct and a foresight to think that investing in it might do something good for me. If there was any proof that Richard Head was a loving, committing father, there it was. With this one act, he gave me everything. So right there, she did talk about that. He wasn't the most loving father in terms of, telling her, but he proved it with his actions. And they made this big investment, as you've talked about in previous episodes, of moving. And I think the impact of her dad is undeniable. It's certainly complex. It's a complex relationship. But we heard with Dan Carter, he had an amazingly close relationship with his dad, as did Lindsey Vonn. And they had really loving relationships. Agassi obviously had a different kind of relationship that was perhaps more dysfunctional. But his dad undoubtedly shaped him. And I do want to recognize that in this era, from a working class family, from a different culture, having a dad that's going to support his female daughter really stands out.
The thing that stands out for me here is that it's not necessarily supporting by word, it's supporting by act. They say actions speak louder than words. I don't think anything speaks much louder than moving house and really giving your daughter the opportunity to do something that she obviously has a passion for and a desire to play, and just opening the door and allowing that opportunity. I don't think there's really more of a thing that you could do as a dad.
As I got ready to go off to college, I knew he was proud of me, but he never told me. I knew he loved me, but he never told me. He took it for granted that everyone would understand he was a kind, loving person. I would spend the coming years driven by a craving for his approval, absolutely determined to show I am a winner who deserves love and praise. But there was another consequence too, a certain wounded inwardness. By the time I left for college, I was a shy, socially awkward young woman who covered up her vulnerabilities. Don't you cry, girl. I better not see you cry. I'd become a little shut off, self-protective. Whatever I felt, I learned not to show it to others. I drew the shades over my eyes. And later, when young women who played for me cried, I told them champions and leaders and strong women don't cry. So I'm certainly not Sigmund Freud, but the Pat Summitt has built up this emotional armor. And I think it definitely kind of connects to her dad, who's told her, as a young female, you do not cry.
This toughness and real steely exterior and self-preservation and those sort of things, those are all great tools to develop, right? And put you in a great stead to be in a high performance and very demanding environment. But also at what cost? When you develop toughness, it often comes at the cost of vulnerability. And for me, those are actually two sides of the same coin, right?
And in this moment, we see in the book she has an opportunity to go to college. She had a successful high school career, whatever that was, in the state of Tennessee at the time. But she got the opportunity to play for the University of Tennessee Martin. And she says, it's difficult to explain to someone who has never competed, but a moment arrives in the life of a serious athlete when the game begins to live in you. It so occupies your mind and body that you almost become it. You gain a sense of such command over your own arm and legs that it almost feels like flying, and you begin to crave that sensation daily. Everything else is just an interruption, and you can return to it later. That was me. I played quite literally in my sleep. So she is living and breathing basketball when she goes to college.
I love that idea of that sort of sense of command and flying. I almost think kind of autopilot there, when you can just do what you want to do, and you're, control, I think, is something that you probably didn't have a lot of, but really having a sense of control and command within sport performance. Man, what a freeing experience that is.
Our training was crude. The conditions were awful, and we thought nothing of it. It hardly occurred to us that we were entitled to better or more. It started in 1972. That year triggered stratospheric growth, a boom. I felt the effects immediately and personally. Universities abandoned their archaic inhibitions and adopted the full court game. And at UT Martin, I could at last play 5-on-5. I began to tell people, I want to play in the Olympics. I spent that summer self-teaching myself the full court game. I got a hold of the Fundamentals of Basketball textbook from my physical education department and studied the diagrams. I went back to Henrietta, and in the hay barn with my brothers, we walked through sets, sometimes using a dog or a bucket as a stand-in. So there's a couple of things that stand out, almost identical to Lindsey Vonn, who said, at 9 years of age, I want to win an Olympic gold medal. Pat saying, she just picked up the 5-on-5 game and says, I want to go to the Olympics. And through this, Greg, she's learning the 5-on-5 game from a book. And it's a very rudimentary beginning for an Olympic athlete. But do we overestimate experts that we need? And maybe it's that she went through that process of self-discovery through passion of, I'm so interested in this game. I'm going to figure it out from books and from whatever I can, and, use a dog and a bucket to set up plays. It's quite incredible when you think about it.
It is absolutely incredible. Yeah, I think first of all, I'll God the dog. That's goes without saying. I also feel we've maybe got a little bit of selection bias going on here, because it just apparently all you need to do to be an Olympic gold medalist is just say, I want to win an Olympic gold medal. And there you go, manna from heaven. But yeah, this is something that we've seen with, certainly with Dan Carter, right, in that exploration of the game. And yes, of course, he was in structured play, as indeed Pat Summitt was here. But that genuine desire, I don't think that is something that perhaps we see enough of in young athletes presently. I'm always quite surprised when I speak to youth athletes, and you might have this experience as well. They're not necessarily fans of their sport in the sense of, yeah, they might watch it or they might follow one or two players, but really getting deep and down and dirty with the nuance of the game and really trying to understand and figure things out and find ways to do things. But I think literally going and trying to find a copy of that book, borrowing it from a PE department and then running through it, that's commitment, that's desire, that's passion, that's purpose, that's drive. That's really back to that why that we started with.
And it might be the beginnings of her as a coach, like understanding plays and how to set those up. And I think we know everything about Coach Summitt really from, her 8 national championships, but she was a really good player. And, I don't want to gloss over that. And she says the result was a huge season for a little team from Tennessee. We went 20-8 and qualified for the inaugural national championship tournament. A review of the box scores show that I averaged 19 points and 15 rebounds a game. So the plays we designed in the Hayloft must have worked. I carried us to the Southern Regional Championships with an upset of North Carolina, where I scored 31 of our 54 points. And like I said, she did go on and she played for the US Olympic team and won a silver medal. So she was quite a player. She had some chops herself.
if you understand the game and how it's meant to be played because you've studied it and the people around you don't, that is just a straight up competitive advantage. And it sounds like she leveraged that all of the way as a player.
As she began to kind of thrive on the college scene, she got this letter. It says, "It is my privilege to invite you to the trials for selection for the World University Games team. The World University Games were an important preliminary to the Olympics to be held in August of 1973 in Moscow, the Soviet Union. Now, I had never even been on an aeroplane, much less out of the country. The farthest I had ever been was Normal, Illinois, in the rear of a station wagon. But I was prepared to fly to Mars if I thought it would get me out of my Kmart clothes and into a uniform that said USA on it. To a farm kid who had never been airborne, the trip for me felt like I was sailing to the end of the world without a map. On the morning I left for Boston, where the trials were held, my family sat around the kitchen table. I hugged my mother and sister, and they were both in tears, and then I put my hand on my father's shoulder. He was, I knew, quietly elated for me. The idea that you could come from Henrietta and go to the Soviet Union and play for the Olympic team, it's almost like that goal is so out of possibility. And it really is that small town kids reaching the big time.
As she says, put the Kmart clothes to one side and wear a uniform that says USA in the World University Games. That's no mean feat.
So now she's stepping up to, represent the US. We hear her kind of first early coaching model. And she says, Billy was the most demanding person I'd met since my father. If you didn't do something exactly right, she snapped again. And then she'd stalk you down the court after you with her hair flopping. If you didn't get it right again, you ran and ran and ran. Again, she would bark. I'd never in my life had to condition at that level or to meet such challenges expressed with such intensity. But I took to Billy instantly. And in retrospect, I think I must have known that here was the kind of person I wanted to be. She had no discernible traces of fear or self-consciousness. She was forceful, uncompromising, strong-voiced, and she didn't seem to think she had to demand less of us because we were women. And if anything, she suggested that she intended to demand more of us because we were women. Obviously, the similarities, kind of that driven intensity between Billy and her father. I think there's a cautious lesson of being wary of who you learn from. And even the best we can learn lessons that we shouldn't necessarily pass on. But this is her first real coach that she's looking up to. And she's learning those lessons of intensity and being demanding.
Great teachers don't always teach great stuff. The thing that really jumped out to me from this was the sentence, and I'll reread, apologies. She had no discernible traces of fear or self-consciousness. So talking about Billy here. And I think this is an interesting sentence for me, because just because there weren't discernible traces sort of visible, that they weren't observable, doesn't mean that fear or self-consciousness wasn't there. All right, it's a natural and entirely normal human experience to have these thoughts and feelings. But the way that Billy decided to present herself to other people, to her players in this situation, is an example of controlling their own narrative and how you wish to portray yourself to other people. So I think that's really, really important. Just because you didn't notice those things, they didn't appear to be there, doesn't mean that they weren't there. These are natural, normal responses and emotions that everyone experiences.
That's an excellent point. And she says of Billy, as I got to know Billy, I found out that she was a farm girl just like me. She recognized something familiar in me, the small town girl fighting to improve herself. I told her about competing with my brothers and described my father and how he raised me like another son, and that I'd discovered that there were different roles for women. Billy replied, when I coach, I just coach players. Playing for Billy, I discovered my identity, a physical, hard-working slasher who carried my elbows up around my ears. I gained so much confidence, in fact, that my parents felt obliged to caution me. Winning doesn't make you better than anyone else, they told me. Losing doesn't make you a bad person either. What goes around comes around, so you better be humble. So she's starting to forge that identity. She's developing some self-confidence, and she's also getting that sense of we can treat people as equals in the 1970s.
I really love that sentence as well. Winning doesn't make you better than anyone else, but losing doesn't make you a bad person either. I think if you take nothing else from the conversation that we're having today. That's a really powerful message, right? And something that could be very easily glossed over.
So jumping ahead from 1973, ultimately Pat gets selected for the US Olympic team to play in the 76 Olympics, and she wins a silver medal against a great Russian team. But she has this distinct understanding about what winning and what having success meant for her as a woman. She says, I remember standing on the medal podium in the 1976 Montreal Olympics, imbued with the sense that if you won enough basketball games, there was no such thing as poor or backward or country or female or inferior. I wanted to influence and to change. There was only one key things change: winning. You change things for women by winning. The example was clear. The medal earned me respect I couldn't have acquired in any other field. It occurred to me that the winner's podium is a pretty good place from which you conduct the women's movement.
I've often heard it said that you should play or compete or perform for something bigger than yourself. And I think that's what's at play here. For me, this is a really good indication that she's starting to see basketball not as a single game, as a winning or losing thing, but maybe as a bit more of a means to an end. And that end isn't literally winning basketball games. It's that ability to influence and that ability to change, and using winning and success and that winner's podium almost as a pulpit to be able to spread that that change and that influence in a useful direction for what she was trying to achieve.
And that's a great connection to this. She said, I remember feeling that an Olympic medal was a mountainous achievement from a girl from Henrietta, Tennessee. And I remember the understanding that came with it. When you set a goal of such distant possibility and reach it, you gain an insight into what it takes that lasts for the rest of your life. It felt utterly life-altering to summon the competitiveness to work every single day for a goal that for months and even years ahead was the most valuable lesson I'd ever learned. I thought I could accomplish anything, and I thought I could teach it to others. So this key life lesson that if you set big goals and you work hard enough towards them, you can achieve them. And she's got that. It's this little nugget, and she's like, and I can teach this to other people.
That is selflessness, to be perfectly honest. If you have a skill, if you have an ability, the ability to impart that and empower other people to essentially develop the same set of skills. I think anyone who's got into education, Duncan, you and myself, we've both worked as educators. You don't get into it for the glamour, you don't get into it for the fame, and God knows you don't get into it for the fortune. But I think you get into it for the genuine desire to help people along their path and realize that you can aim big and you can empower people and give them the skills to essentially create change in the world, right? There's that cliche, as it were, be the change you want to see in the world. And I think teaching is an unbelievable vehicle to empower people to manifest that change.
As we transition here in a story, Greg, it's really the beginning of her career at the University of Tennessee. And as she starts, she gets some recruiting advice that really made me chuckle. And the line was, you don't take donkeys to the Kentucky Derby. Nevertheless, there was something in what he said. It was lesson number one, the most fundamental fact of coaching. It was all about the players. There were lots of other things that I could do as a coach, but I couldn't go out there and make the kids taller or faster. You have to have the players as a coach. That's absolutely essential. And I think in college and pros, that's even obviously heightened. We're not talking youth sport here. But I think there's lessons for recruiting and hiring just across all performance domains. Having the people in the door to start with, you can only do so much with them.
Yeah, it would be great if all we could do was hire Kentucky Derby winners, right? If that was the way things work. But of course we know that's not realistic. Now I'm not saying that you can bring donkeys in and sort of develop them to win the Kentucky Derby, but very rarely do we actually get the complete finished article. So knowing that there's room for people to grow here, but if you're fortunate enough to be able to bring in some absolutely top class athletes, that's just going to make your job easier as a coach. If you're able to bring in some top class employees into the corporate world, that's going to make your job easier. Now, trying to get them all pulling in the same direction and working together to achieve a shared outcome, maybe that's a little bit more unique as a coach, but that's definitely a challenge of a manager or anyone in a sort of business performance setting as well.
And Pat reflects here her early coaching style. She says, looking back on it, that first team put up with an awful lot. From a young, hard-headed coach, I was reluctant to get too friendly with them or to even laugh in case it might undermine my authority. I built a wall so that they would know that despite our ages, I was in charge. My style was intentionally barking and intimidating. Now that's just a playbook right from Billy Hay USA coach, isn't it?
We often coach the way that we were coached. We often teach the way that we were taught, and for better or for worse, the sum total of those things come along for the ride. Particularly if you don't have a particularly diverse performance background, right? If that is the most meaningful and most impactful person in your field, yeah, of course you're going to bring those things through. To quote the late great Kenny Rogers, right? You've got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them. You've got to know when to hold on to the great coaching behaviors that you've inherited from other people. But you've also got to know when to kind of just push those cards back across the table when they're not useful to you in that moment. Can you continue to evolve and maybe just look to play the next hand? Yeah, you're going to learn a lot of great lessons going forward, but you're also going to bring a lot of not great baggage along for the ride too. Can you continue with the good stuff and get rid of the bad stuff?
Yeah, and we know where Pat finished at the end of her 38 years with all those achievements I mentioned at the beginning, but it was not like that at the start. She says, "We finished with a 16-8 record. I was just a 22-year-old kid fighting through the job. I was confused and blind to the future. Someone who didn't know what they were doing yet, except that I loved the game and I wanted to grow it. The Tennessee program wasn't designed to make a basketball coach out of me. It was to make me an educator, and I discovered that I loved the job." So she was very raw. She didn't know anything. She was a 22-year-old. Obviously, they had a winning season, but she's starting to get this idea that she wants to grow the game of basketball and she wants to be an educator, which you've mentioned previously.
If you want to be a trailblazer, unfortunately, the path is going to have to be, or the trail is going to have to be blazed by you. If there's nothing ahead of you, you're going to have to kind of learn on the job or on the spot training, right?
And even though it was right at the beginning, she knew some of the key principles that she wanted to instill. She says, a lot of people are afraid of commitment because it means they'll have to say, that's the best I can do. They elect to be average. When you compete, you decide to find out what your real limits are, not just what you think they are. I wasn't afraid of that commitment or demanding it from others. At the University of Tennessee, from 1976 to 1977, we committed. We gave it everything we had and lost. There were no trophies or glittering rings and little applause in those years. But we laid the foundation, the foundational values for Lady Vols basketball on which everything that came after was built. Effort, discipline, and intensity. There was something else too. There was another foundational value, though I had trouble expressing it. Love. That was there. Underneath all the yelling, there was love. So Coach Summitt is laying those principles and those foundation, effort, discipline, intensity, and love underneath it, even though the players might not have felt it.
For me, and this is an analogy you've used once upon a time, I can't remember what the context is, but when we're talking about the foundational values here, if we think about the foundations, if we're building a house, as it were, for me right here, effort, discipline, and intensity, those are three bricks, right? If we're building a wall, those are the three bricks. And when I hear this, I see love as being the mortar or the concrete that holds those things together, right? Where it might not necessarily seem that it's center stage, but it's actually woven through all of the different elements. And, without that, what happens? Well, the wall crumbles. It's basically a dry stone wall, and any pressure it puts on it will tip it. But the fact that it's there and it's the glue that holds everything together, whether it's known or not, whether it's obvious or not, this can't succeed without that cement, without that mortar, without that love.
I was hard on all of them, harder than I would ever be on a team again. So hard that in retrospect, I don't know how they didn't break or quit. I couldn't have played for me then. I was so committed, so unsmiling, and intent on building the program that I must have seemed like a skull with a lipstick. You had to be willing to physically outwork and out-tough everyone in your path. I recruited guys to practice against and made Trish and the other players go against them every day. I wanted our players to learn to hold their ground, and when they didn't, I sneered babies and said sissies, nice girls. It's quite obvious here for me. There's a connection back. She grew up playing her brothers, and that physically outwork, that idea of growing up in the Tennessee tobacco fields, that idea of easy choices, hard life, hard choices, easy life.
That's really nicely put. I think that's when anyone that's trying to reach some sort of goal, some sort of target, very rarely, unfortunately, is the easy choice, the choice that's going to get you to your long-term goal. I think you can't outrun your history, right? And I think this again is Coach Summitt's history of spending time with her brothers and developing her philosophy and ethic and principles, not only how to play the game, but also how to play the game. Some of this you could quite easily disagree with, but I think that it's definitely a reflection on how she was raised and brought up in that environment.
And one of those elements being brought up was discipline. And she says, shortly after Christmas, I got word that they had pulled an all-nighter. I decided I'm going to run them until they can't puke anymore. When they arrived for practice that day, bleary-eyed and rank, I waited for them with 4 garbage cans placed strategically on each corner of the gym. Get on the line, I said. No amount of disciplining could tame them. They just went right back up to living it up. I worked them until they crawled out the gym, and then they just popped back up ready for more. They had no quit in them. So she's really talking about pushing her team here. But I also get a sense that Coach Summitt loved this, that this team wouldn't back down. These were the early teams. These girls, they probably college basketball was a dream for them, but they had some character about them. They just kept going.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like there's plenty of characters on this team as well. I know we're going to dive into a few, so why don't we get rolling with that?
And this is Holly Warlick, who was, a long-time assistant, also a former head coach at the University of Tennessee. And she said, we were scared of her and we loved her. I would walk out going, she's crazy as hell. Then I'd come back the next day and she'd challenge me again and I'd respond and throw it back in her face. She knew that. And I'd be like, I'll show her. Yeah, we'll show her. That's what she wanted. So it's that kind of challenge. She wanted that environment that athletes would challenge her, would push her, but they were scared of her and she was crazy as hell.
It's how eloquently put. I think not necessarily just the challenge, but rising to the challenge and meeting that challenge and exceeding that challenge. I don't think this is the environment for everyone. Not everyone's going to thrive in these situations and with these quote unquote tests. But it sounds very much like the players that she had there within those teams saw this most certainly as a challenge, not as a threat, even though they were slightly scared of her.
So Pat reflects about that challenging. She says, I'll never push you more than I'll push myself, I said. It never occurred to me to ask what demon was pushing me so hard in the back. I pushed and pushed, and then I'd walk out the gym and leave Nancy, who is her full-time assistant, to bind up their emotional wounds, soothe their feelings, and listen to their woes. So what was pushing her, Greg? What was pushing Pat and her need for approval from her dad, maybe?
I think it's the unfortunate thing is when it comes to motivation, it's multifaceted, it's complicated. It sounds like Pat didn't have a single driving factor here. Now we kind of understand her why and the humble beginnings that she's come from and wanting to grow the game and all of these things. But at the end of the day, we're shaped by the sum total of our experiences. And while we might say quite eloquently that we have a single purpose, that we have a single why, it's a little more messy than that. And we have to, spend time to unpick that. And I don't know if we ever come to a really clear answer.
And this idea, you hear more from her in terms of how she just, her framework and how she thought about life. She said, it was all in the name of making them stronger. Feel bullied? Do something about it. Suffer a setback? Handle it. The one thing I hated, the one thing I couldn't stand was when they acted weak or hurt or intimidated. But eventually I changed. And if I hadn't, we wouldn't be having this conversation. You'd be talking to someone else. Because the kids would have all quit and would have all burned out fast. Jill Rankin, a player of mine, taught me that I could be demanding and still have fun. The two were mutually exclusive. So you hear that kind of two sides of the coin there, that she was very demanding and she was learning as she was going that there's always going to be a limit there of how much you can push people and how much they're willing to take.
Listen, we talk about the evolution of coaches, but we often talk about this in terms of their style of play or their system. But equally important, maybe even more important, is for coaches to evolve in how they approach their coaching, how they deliver information about their systems, how they coach the person as well as the athlete. So I like to think about this in terms of like updating software on your phone. So we get this all the time. every so often your phone's going to remind you that you like a new and improved operating system's available, version 17.2 point whatever it is, right? We get those notifications all the time. Now, when you think about, well, why do I need to update my phone? What's the point here? The update provides, maybe it's new tools, maybe it's more efficient processes, even things that might run in the background that you're not even aware of. And more importantly, maybe bug fixes to make your device run smoothly and safely. Now, as a coach, you can do exactly the same, but it takes deliberate effort. It's not like your phone. No one's going to bing send you that notification and let you know that it's time to update your coaching practices. It's something that you've got to, when we go back to that examining, the self-awareness piece, it's something that you've got to go and dig into and think about, okay, what's working for me? What could be better? How am I going to do that? And update your coaching software that way. But when we talk about the evolution of coaches, maybe it's not always about the system or the style of play, but it's about the how they teach that and how they coach the person, not just the athlete.
I think what you're talking about there, and part of it might be, having a specific purpose to what you're doing, not just doing it mindlessly. And she said, I didn't punish our players just to make myself feel better. Those workouts had a purpose. I was trying to teach them a lesson about commitment. I measured our performance by two things: effort and execution. I was willing to coach execution for as long and as forgivingly as our players needed me to. I was a taskmaster, but a patient one when it came to execution. But I wasn't patient or forgiving about effort. Lack of effort was a lack of respect for your teammates and for your coaching staff and for me. With a lack of effort, one lackadaisical player compromised efforts of all of us. So effort and execution, clear principles.
Absolutely, crystal clear. No ambiguity there. But notice that effort and execution aren't necessarily dependent on winning, right? You don't have to have winning, a competitive outcome, be part of this. I think effort and execution certainly grease the wheel of success. But when we're talking about coaches here, sometimes are people that are leading a group of performers, sometimes it's very, very easy to get focused on outcomes that are essentially out of your control, right? To win, someone has to lose, and there's a lot of other things that are massively dependent. But effort and execution, those are largely under your control. So I really like that these are principles that you can use to drive any performance forward.
She's establishing a demanding environment here. And she says, why did they accept it instead of quit or revolt? The answer was that I'd become sure of was I was securing my relationships with my players. My demandingness was based in a fundamental sense that every kid had a potential greatness in her. And they understood that because I made it clear to them. I learned the single most important principle of teaching. They don't care how much you know unless they know how much you care. So this is a really demanding yet caring environment. And I want to take us to a little bit of research here, Greg, which I know you're very familiar with. This idea of a resilience framework, there's a couple of researchers out of the UK, Sarkar and Fletcher, and the resilience framework really has this 4 quadrants, and it's based on this concept of challenge and support. So the 4 quadrants would be, when we have low challenge and low support in an environment, we have what we'd call a really stagnant environment where no high performance lives in a stagnant environment. There's not a lot of challenge, there's not a lot of support. The next quadrant would be really low challenge but high support, and that would be a really comfortable environment that's not challenging for athletes. So they just feel potentially coddled. And the next quadrant would be high challenge, low support. So you're really pushing, demanding, but the support is not there. And that's what we'd call an unrelenting environment where there's probably a lot of burnout. A toxic culture might exist. And the last one, the optimal environment or culture that Sarkar and Fletcher talk about, is really a facilitative environment, high challenge, high support. So that ultimately means you need to challenge and push each individual while simultaneously you must support them, both physically, emotionally, making sure they get rest, making sure they feel cared for. So I think this idea of high challenge, high support can have applications across all sorts of performance domains.
Without a shadow of a doubt, and you've done a wonderful job there explaining it. And I think when people hear resilient or resiliency, they usually think about that as an individual trait, as opposed to perhaps a product of an environment. But thinking about, okay, me as a coach, me as a leader, me as someone that is kind of in charge of a group or a performer, how do you create the conditions in which resilience can come to the forefront. And you've done like I say, you've done a wonderful job sort of outlining how we can get that high challenge, but if not more importantly, high support, facilitative environment where you continue to push everyone to be their best while providing the support to get them there.
It was like I told all of them. The day I didn't get on them was the day they knew I didn't care. If I had one great strength as a coach, it was that I got the most out of people. Personally, I love this idea that with all performers, that when I work with performers, I use this concept of everything you need is already inside you. And I'm going to help you through the work together to hopefully bring it out. And sometimes you just need someone else to bring out your greatness within you. And I think Coach Summitt believed that potential of greatness in everyone. And she was gonna do everything in her power to try and get it out of you. But at the same time, she made sure that you knew that she cared for you.
When you play for a coach like Pat Summitt, you know what you're walking into, right? You know it's going to be demanding, and you know that, and it should be a huge compliment that you have been basically hand selected as someone that she thinks can someone that can thrive in this environment. A little Freudian slip there, I guess, right? Someone that can thrive in this situation or environment, and it's going to get the most out of you. So this is something for you to think about if you're in charge of building a team, or you're a coach or a leader, particularly someone who's capable of recruiting and bringing in personnel. You also have to be aware of, will those people that you're bringing into that environment respond positively to this type of leadership? So you want to think about, okay, the makeup of this team, what's coming into play. There's me as a leader. There's the people that are coming in as followers, or people that are coming into my team. How are those two things going to come together? And is this going to be a facilitative environment where everyone can get the best out of this situation?
And that coming together really resonates in this next section for me. And you hear her development in terms of her coaching philosophy. She says, the idea of coaching and parenting wasn't to create obedient robots moving in predetermined choreography. Discipline only took you so far. I was finally becoming more creative, resourceful coach. I no longer thought I had to be in control of everything and of everybody. In fact, if there was one thing I realized, it was that once the game starts, a coach can't physically control what's happening. You can't move bodies from point A to point B. The job of the coach wasn't to be a martinet. It was about preparing people to make good, independent decisions, getting them in the right spots at the right time. So for me, Coach Summitt here is really talking about developing her coaching philosophy. And the term that stands out for me, and I know you'll jump on this, is make them independent decision makers, right? Make independent decisions.
Yeah, that's what coaching is. It's about equipping people with the skills to be able to go out and do it. Ultimately, what that allows you to do is to sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Players like Becky Clark were shaping me as much as I was shaping them. Each one seemed to come with some moral, insight, or lesson about teaching. Sometimes it felt like picking a series of locks. How could I spring open their potential? My coaching was becoming more reciprocal and responsive, a matter of understanding their makeup rather than just pulling them by the strings. The better I got to know our players, the more I was able to search out their competitive personalities, find their insecurities, and shore them up. She's learning how to manage people here, reciprocal and responsive.
I love this idea of finding people's insecurities, not to exploit them, but to address them and to shore them up. I think that's wonderful. When we talk about a caring environment, for me, that's what that looks like.
They were having a lot of success, but they weren't breaking through to win the big one. She says, I'll say this for us, we were good losers. It was our 5th trip to the Final Four in 7-year stretch, and we'd lost every time. I racked my brain trying to figure out what the difference was between us and the other teams that won. What do I need to do? I asked Nancy. Is it the players? Is it me? I was simply still learning against older and more experienced coaches. I stared at the tape, trying to analyze my weaknesses. If I had gone to zone, would it have changed the momentum? Why didn't I switch defenses? Should I have conditioned us differently so that we'd have fresher legs? I felt like I cost us because whether I was stubborn or limited or not able to see the entire floor, I gritted my teeth and said, someday we're going to win a championship. As hard as I took our losses, there was a dignity in them. We were willing to fail. Commitment is all about risk. The payoff is either heartbreak or exhilaration, but it's all about tedium, the willingness to persevere through problems without quit. More important, without demoralization. It's a kind of faith. So we're really seeing this self-reflection. And through self-reflection, Greg, I think you derive some wisdom, and she's really reflecting on these losses and her own coaching, and she's gaining these insights. And there's that idea, there's always one more thing you can do, and she is going to push, and she is going to win a championship.
There's a lot of sort of shoulda, woulda, coulda, right? What could I have done differently? Should I have changed here? And you know, you can always look back on these things and critically analyze them. But I think what she's doing here, she's trying to find that competitive advantage. You know, experience, when she talks about experienced coaches, how do you become an experienced anything? You do it for a long period of time, right? And it's very rarely a glamorous thing to do. The phrase that I really like is monotonous consistency. Are you willing to just do, let's face it, the boring things repeatedly over and over and over again in order to get to the destination that you want? And that is a massively underrated and perhaps more importantly, underutilized skill, to be comfortable to just continue to chip away and do it over and over again. And that's not just about winning basketball games. That's really about anything in life. If you're trying to develop a new skill, if you're trying to make a life change, or, you know, some sort of behavioral change within your life, or some sort of lifestyle change, monotonous consistency is usually the path that gets you there best. Unfortunately, it doesn't get you there the quickest.
But they kept chipping away. And then next year, they broke through and won Tennessee's first national championship, thanks to that setup. In 1986, 1987, it all finally came together for us. The players, the staff, and philosophy. It seemed like every kid on that team needed something more from me than just basketball coaching, a different kind of caring. They were all a project, all of them interesting characters with their own issues. Some of them needed love, and some of them needed tough love. Greg, coaching is so much more than the X's and O's.
What are the X's and O's when you write them down on a piece of paper? What do they represent? They're not X's and O's, they're people. It's just something that we do to make it easy in terms of shorthand. I think knowing who you are and knowing who your players are, and recognizing that they're more than just the name and the number on a jersey, recognizing that they're people, caring about those people. If you don't win, which, let's face it, majority of all teams apart from one don't win a national title. If you can do that with care and love and, you know, development of people rather than just players, that's really what it's all about. It's an anomaly to win a national title. Like, what are you going to do in all of those, you know, 99% of the times you compete and you train and you develop usually young people? What are you going to do in those moments when you're not winning things? And I think this is a really nice lesson here. It's about that mortar between those bricks, love.
And we've heard from a couple of our performers that, you know, winning the big one kind of didn't feel that good, or it was a little bit of a letdown. Pat says it felt every bit as good as I could have imagined, every bit. I felt flooded with a sense of completion and gratitude. I hugged every single Lady Vol and thanked them individually for making it happen. I said, this team has played as hard and as smart as I could have asked any team to play. And I think this last bit, there's kind of more insight into this evolution of her coaching and the autonomy she's now giving her players. She says, I couldn't drive them to a championship with a whip in a chair like a lion tamer. It was too draining. They had to meet me halfway. Everything within our system was increasingly designed to teach players to make good independent judgments. I was beginning to change the way we practice, to encourage players to think for themselves. I created game situations that forced them to make their own decisions. Instead of giving them a playbook, I made them draw up all of our schemes in their own notebooks. Rather than giving them a handout of our team policies, I made them write them out. So this evolution, they're having a lot of success, not breaking through, but she's thinking differently. And that idea of motivation and the concept we talked about before with self-determination theory, she's giving them autonomy. She's making them independent thinkers. She's getting them to draw up their own plays, probably, you know, reminiscent of, you know, reading that playbook and drawing out her own plays in the hay barn. But I think that idea of empowering people just screams out in that paragraph here.
If you give people some control and some autonomy and the power to make their own decisions and to make their own rules, that's stuff that fosters accountability. That's stuff that fosters responsibility. That's stuff that fosters commitment. That's stuff that fosters ownership. And that's that high support, high challenge environment that you talked about, that really facilitative environment where when people can take ownership of what they're being asked to do, drive it in the way that they feel is best with the backing of someone that has expertise and knowledge and experience in this arena, let's face it, the sky's the limit.
Now, Pat Summitt had a 38-year career, Greg. We were never going to fit this into one podcast. I think this is a great place to stop. This is the end of part 1.